My name is Andre Ward, and I'm the Associate Vice President for the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy. Welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines various perspectives from the legal system, and including people who are most impacted by it. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and we highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone affected. We ask you, the viewers, to spread the word about Both Sides of the Bars and share your comments with us on Twitter at The Fortune SOC. Today's show is entitled Focusing on the Wrongfully Convicted. And we're here today to talk about two exonerees who were 16 and 20 years old, respectively, behind bars before DNA proved their innocence. And so, when we think about this whole idea of wrongful convictions, as the pace of DNA exonerations has grown nationwide in recent years, wrongful convictions have really revealed disturbing fissures and trends in our criminal justice system. Those who have been exonerated by DNA testing aren't the only people who have been wrongly convicted in recent decades. For every case that involves DNA, there are hundreds that do not. Only a fraction of criminal cases involve biological evidence that can be subjected to DNA testing. And even such evidence exists, it is often lost or destroyed after a conviction. Since they don't have access to a definitive test like DNA, many wrongfully convicted people have a slim chance of ever proving themselves innocent. There are more innocent people in our jails and prisons today than ever before. The rate of exonerations continues to rise, revealing an unreliable system of criminal justice. A lack of accountability for police and prosecutors, and a reliance on junk science and mistaken eyewitnesses are major contributors to wrongful convictions that really have undermined the credibility of our system and ruined the lives of innocent men and women. Today's episode on Both Sides of the Bars will focus on two people, one of whom is Jeffrey Deskovic. Jeffrey Deskovic is a former exoneree and president of the Deskovic Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to the exoneration of the wrongfully convicted, their recovery, and reform of the system that allows these miscarriages of justice to take place. The Deskovic Foundation is responsible for freeing 11 wrongfully convicted people and has helped pass 8 laws. And then we also have our second guest, it's Keon Sprinkle, who is of Boston. He was wrongfully convicted of a crime he did not commit, and he spent 20 years based on that wrongful conviction in prison. He was released in February of 2020 after his conviction was overturned, and he was able to return home to his family. Keon worked in partnership with the New England Innocence Project and a pro bono legal team. Jeffrey, Keon, thank you for joining us here at Both Sides of the Bars.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I want to get right into it. Each of you have been wrongfully convicted. Subsequent to obviously pushing litigation, were exonerated, totally exonerated for your convictions. And here you are now, both involved in work to support others who have been wrongfully convicted so that they too can be exonerated. I want to start with this first question, and I'll start it with Keon, and then I'll obviously turn it over to Jeffrey. But this idea of people being wrongfully convicted, how does the presumption of innocence really serve to some degree to be an illusion, right? When people enter into the criminal legal system, right, they're presumed innocent. But when we talk about wrongful conviction especially, how does the presumption of innocence really seem like an illusion? Keon?
All right. So just a couple of things quickly. So I'm one of the first people in my state that the New England Innocence Project dealt with that got exonerated and the case got picked up without, DNA evidence, right? So I just wanted to say that. And I was incarcerated since 17, not 20, but I was convicted at 20 though. Most of the time when we see movies and things like that, we normally see a perpetrator do a crime and then we see them pursue the person. And then once the person gets arrested, that's it. So a lot of people are coming into these courtrooms, and as soon as they sit down, when they look at you, they automatically have like a unnoticed bias that, he must be here for something, right? So that presumption of innocence doesn't really exist, especially if you have a lawyer that tells you don't take the stand in your own defense. It's kind of like if someone's talking a lot about one person, but the person never speaks up. Normally, from normal interactions, we tend to think that, well, the person's not saying something because, he's guilty or something, but it could be for numerous reasons why. So I think there's a lot of public biases in public perceptions that we have that make people feel like, a person could be guilty even though they're innocent.
And so I want to shift to you, Jeffrey. Jeffrey, you've been home now for several years, right? I know your work, right? You've since come home after your release now. I think you've been home over several years or so. But now, obviously you graduated from law school following your exoneration. You are an attorney now. And so the law, especially as someone who is now an attorney. So speak to that, Jeffrey. The whole idea, yes, you have to acknowledge Jeffrey, obviously, for that accomplishment and the work that he's doing, like you, Keon, to make sure others are exonerated. But Jeffrey, talk to this presumption of innocence, right? How it can obviously be, especially from the perspective of wrongfully convicted, an illusion.
Yeah, it's definitely an illusion. I've been home for 14 years now. So I think that it's an illusion in the sense that, up until bail reform was happening, people were still being incarcerated, pending the trial as a means of, ostensibly as a means of keeping society safe. But that in and of itself is contrary to a belief in a presumption of innocence, because why do you have to keep people safe from somebody that's presumed to be innocent? So that's one aspect of it. In terms of in the courtroom, I agree with Keon that I think that a lot of jurors do not understand the idea of guilty and until proven innocent. I think that they vote to convict if they simply think that the defendant is guilty, as opposed to also asking themselves, well, I understand, I think that someone's guilty, but did the government actually prove it? I think that's a subtlety that's lost on common people. Beyond that, jurors do have concepts in their mind, like Keon mentioned. If the defendant doesn't testify, the thought a lot of people, everyday people have, and remember that the jury is made up of everyday people, the thought that everyday people have is, well, you must have something that you're hiding, and that's why you're not taking a stand. And of course, that other thought, I believe that the defense starts out behind, they don't, to use a sports metaphor in racing, they don't start out at the same place. I believe that defendants, start in the back, the prosecution is ahead. And the thought is that a lot of people have is, well, obviously, if you didn't do it, then they wouldn't have arrested you for it. And then the last aspect of that, outside of the courtroom, which is just in the court of public opinion, the media, one of the causes of wrongful conviction is pretrial prejudicial publicity. That certainly was a factor in my wrongful conviction case, and it's a factor in many other cases. So outside of the courtroom, as a society, I don't think that we give much credence to the presumption of innocence. And so in that aspect of it, it's also illusory.
How does the very legal system itself kind of feed that unconscious bias? Each of you have experienced it in different ways relative to jurors, et cetera. But how does the system itself, right, kind of feed, right, folks' unconscious bias? Bias, like you said, is shaped and attributed to what people see on television, their own like personal views vis-a-vis how they've experienced the world. How does the legal system do that? And I'll start with you, Jeffrey, and then we'll go to Keon.
Well, the legal system does it. I think that defense attorneys play a really big role in that. So they're an actor within the justice system itself. And a common school of thought is that they don't comment to the media, but prosecutors and police are commenting. They're not commenting. They're not allowing their clients to answer. And I think that the thought is, well, my client's going to say something to incriminate him or herself. But that right there shows that even your own attorney may be thinking, that you're guilty. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is what's called tunnel vision, which is when a conclusion is made, only paying attention to evidence that confirms it and ignoring other evidence that does not, or coming up with some obscure definition that often defies common sense. So in my case, for example, just to put some color to that, when the DNA didn't match me before the trial, it showed that semen in the victim matched someone else. The prosecutor suddenly, they started dropping the case and refocusing investigation. They came up with this obscure theory. Oh, well, the victim must have slept with someone else before you murdered and raped her, going so far as to name somebody, but never trying to actually prove that. And then actually working against evidence. So the police went in the field, they interviewed 17 witnesses that knew the victim in one way or another, and all of them told the police that there was no consensual sex, there was no boyfriend, but the police did not document those witness interviews, and hence it was never turned over. So I think that those biases are built in. But maybe one last quick point is that one of the conservative points of view from defense lawyers is they're even afraid to put on a defense. Like, I went to law school, I trained under lawyers, and we don't want to call witnesses because then it becomes about their credibility, and and we're taking the burden of proof away from the prosecution, we're putting it on ourselves. But that tactic doesn't work when you're defending innocent people. I think it's really important to put on any and all evidence that you can in order to prove your client's innocence. And lastly, when there's a confession case, the general public, of which the jury is made up, they simply don't believe that an innocent person would falsely confess, whereas that's caused wrongful convictions in 25% of the cases. So in reality, when you defend a case like that, you have to answer that confession. You have to explain that confession. You have to disprove it. Very important for your client to take the stand. Yeah, I falsely confessed. Here's why. But lawyers don't do that. And so I think that's another part of the bias that's built in. I think the motivation or the rationale behind some attorneys is they think that their clients are guilty also.
Interesting. And Keon, again, Jeffrey talks about this prosecutorial tunnel vision, as you know all too well about too. And some examples of that, this idea of like how, right, inherent in the very judicial process itself, right, is the feeding of people's unconscious bias connected to this prosecutorial tunnel vision. So talk a little bit about that, Keon.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to say all this out. So I'll start with, I want to take some time just to talk about the whole indictment process versus the bound over process. So this indictment process is a cheap way to really be able to get a person in my state. I don't know how it works everywhere, to get a person from district court to superior court. So what happens is, if I have a conversation, there's three of us on the phone, and I say, hey, Sprite was there when Keon and Jeffrey was having this interview. Sprite heard Keon tell Jeffrey to walk over here. When Jeffrey walked over here, Sprite heard a sound, right? The lawyers never get a chance to put any evidence in front of this petty jury to be able to say, well, this doesn't add up or that doesn't add up. So the only question is, should this person stand a trial? They're going to say, yeah, they just indicted a soda, right? That's how easy the indictment process is. The bound over process was supposed to be the DA puts forward whatever they feel is evidence, and then the lawyers put something to kind of knock that down, and then the judge will decide whether there's enough to bring you over or not. But to stop the power of the judge or even stop that process, they just go for indictment to make it easier for themselves. So that's something that has to stop. As far as the tunnel vision, in my situation, there wasn't no independent witness that ever mentioned me at all. The law enforcement felt as if I was the one, and they went to every witness after hearing from other people and said my name, Keon Sprinkle, to the point that one witness was like, you think he did it? And then it changed to, I'm the one who killed this man, right? And then to the last part, as far as bias, like, I wear jewelry and things, not just because I want to be flashy, but I do it for what I believe Jay-Z has dreads now for. It's like people perceive people when they wear jewelry or have certain hairstyles as being something like this or something like that, especially if you don't live in certain communities. So I feel like when we're on settings like this to show social, expression, and we still be able to talk and be just as normal as anybody else, can hopefully snap that idea of when you look at a person, they look like they committed a crime or they look smart. You can't look no way. You have to either you did it or you didn't. So that's kind of what I feel like the main point is. That indictment process is bananas. And Jeffrey can definitely probably speak about that way better.
Yeah, and I think obviously Jeff can speak to that. And Jeff, we'd like for you to speak to that briefly. But I also want to go into the fact that each of you were arrested, right, prosecuted, and sentenced as juveniles, right? And what was that like for each of you, knowing that you were completely innocent of those crimes, right? And then years later now, it's obviously exonerated.
Well, I agree with Keon. I mean, in indictment process, there's only one side. It's only the prosecutor. Defendant's not there, defense attorney's not there. So therefore, since they're not present, and the whole process is secret, there's no way to really prevent an indictment, and really any prosecutor can control the grand jury. So the system is even set up where it's not just the prosecutor presenting evidence, but then answering legal questions to the grand jury. So it's like you're an advocate, but you're also kind of a judge, also responsible for giving the law. So I agree with Keon that really is a broken system. Pivoting to the other question that you asked, I was arrested when I was 16. I was wrongfully convicted when I was 17. So it was terrifying to be, on trial for a crime that I didn't commit, and at any age, but really particularly for me at that age, there was all the prejudicial pretrial publicity. It felt like an out of control type of feeling. I had a very limited understanding of what was even going on in the courtroom, and that was a situation that my defense attorney made worse. So he actually found a way to make the attorney-client privilege work against me. So when I wanted to have my mother or other family members participate in conversations with him when he was explaining court procedures or even strategic decisions, such as whether I was going to have a jury trial or a judge trial, or was I going to take the stand or not, he wouldn't discuss those issues with an adult. And I'm 17 years old and I don't fully understand what was going on. And because I had been charged as an adult, I was tried as an adult, and I was given an adult sentence, 15 to life sentence, rather than getting a 9 to life sentence. And because of all those factors, I was sent to a men's maximum security prison, not a division for youth. So here I'm in prison with fully formed adults, many of whom were guilty of serious violent crimes, and I'm in over my head. What am I going to do physically in a fight against a 25, 30-year-old man? And then I got this bullseye on my back because I was not simply wrongfully convicted of murder, but I was also wrongfully convicted of a rape. And there's a vigilante mentality towards people who've been convicted of sex offenses.
Keon?
So, just briefly, I didn't have the same experience as far as the lawyer that he had. My lawyer was great. My investigator was great, but it was the first murder trial he ever had. And unfortunately, he lost it. But he worked pro bono all the way with me until I finally came home. So, I just want to give a shout out to E. Peter Parker for that. But as far as me going inside of the prison, it was like, it sucks because you just got found guilty. So you're going through shock, because I thought, God ain't gonna let me go to prison for something I didn't do. I'm just waiting to go to trial. I had to wait 2 years to go to trial, but I couldn't wait till I got there, even though I was nervous because I'm going to trial, but I didn't feel like I can be found guilty. When I was, though, I'm coming into a man's prison, like he said. Now, I'm coming from a certain area, so there's some guys that might have been there before me that kind of knew me growing up, but I don't know who the victim's family is, who their friends are, or anything. But I have a last name, which is Sprinkle. So every time they called me for ID, to strip, to put clothes on, whatever, it was Sprinkle, 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 Sprinkle. So I felt like I was being just hot and stabbed, because it's like, now I don't know which way any harm could be coming to me because everyone's going to know me before I know them. So I didn't even have time to process the fact that I just got found guilty and that they said that I'm going to spend the rest of my life in prison, because I had to just figure out how am I going to stay safe and survive first. And it took me a few years and a few fights and things to even get to the point where I can just focus on, now let me try to work to try to get home, which is unfortunate.
Absolutely. And I know, Jeffrey, if you can talk a little bit more about, just a different aspect of being about the psychological effects of being incarcerated behind bars, right? If you can share like a different aspect to that too, I think that's also important for this conversation around especially around wrongful convictions.
I think being a 17-year-old, it made it particularly difficult psychologically to deal with being in prison. I mean, it took me years to get used to just being in a cell and being around the walls. I mean, you could stick your hands out on both sides and really touch the wall. And besides being confined, that sense of claustrophobia, but also I had to keep fighting off feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, thoughts of giving up, thoughts of suicide came in my head. So all those were factors.
Absolutely. And, I want to transition now because we have only a few minutes left, unfortunately. But I think another critical part of wrongful convictions and being an exoneree is this whole idea of difficulty transitioning back into society. So I'd like for each of you to speak on that. I'll start with you, Keon. Like, what was that like for you? And for some of others who who are exonerees, Keon, what are they talking about in terms of their transitioning back into society following spending decades even behind bars after being wrongfully convicted and exonerated?
Well, for us in our state, the New England Innocence Project, people that was free, we have a real close knit. So we talk a lot. So I can speak to that. As far as transitioning, for me, I was a child going in. So I had to learn how to kind of behave, or at least act like I'm willing to behave like a predator. And then it just kind of becomes like normal. You're not used to hearing people say F you, or people honk horns or flip you a bird and things like that, because in prison, every action like that has a certain consequence. So now I have daughters, and my daughters are in college, and they get mad at me sometimes for no reason. They just wake up and they just don't want to be bothered. And, they give me certain type of attitudes, and I had to really learn how to process that in a way where I'm not like, well, you're saying F me, so F you, because it's my daughter. This is someone who loves me, that I love. I'm not supposed to give that type of attitude, but that's what I've been taught since 17. So I had to sit with my daughter and say, yo, look, I don't know what I'm supposed to do when you feel these ways. I don't know if I'm supposed to talk to you. I don't know if I'm supposed to give you space. This is hard for me. So when I'm doing something wrong, or even if I'm doing something right, if you don't tell me right now, at least tell me later, like, you did that right, Dad. I was just being, mean at that particular point, because that's a lot. And dealing with people who actually love you versus dealing with people who pretend like they love you because they think they can get something is a big difference.
Jeffrey?
Sure. So different aspects. So firstly, because I was wrongfully imprisoned from age 17 to 32, it was particularly difficult for me. I never had before had gotten a driver's license. I'd never lived alone. I never wrote a check. I never went shopping. I never had to manage a budget. That was the period of life where a lot of rites of passage, such as finishing education at a more traditional age, being on my way to a career, all those things I missed out on. There's the psychological after effects of the experience. It's common for people who have been wrongfully imprisoned to have PTSD, panic attacks, anxiety, feeling of processing things at a slower speed, feeling of having been frozen in time. I was released at age 32, and I felt like I was 17. There's a stigma, people acknowledge that I was in prison wrongfully for 16 years, but I was there for 16 years. How much of that rubbed off on me? Is it safe to be alone someplace with me? Technologically, cell phones, GPS, internet had not been created. Culture was totally different. Neighborhoods didn't look the same. Different people lived in those areas. So cumulatively, it felt like I was in a parallel world, a place that did not belonged to me, that I was not part of. I was always passed over for gainful employment, so it was hard to make ends meet. At one point, I was a couple of weeks away from the homeless shelter. I forced myself to break habits. I mean, I stopped using the prison jargon, and I would force myself to sit with my back to people if I was in a restaurant. Last aspect of it is I found it hard to communicate with friends and family because I knew that nothing in their background would enable them to understand what is it like to be charged with something that you didn't do. You know, the terror of being at trial, being wrongfully convicted, being wrongfully imprisoned, trying to transition. And it's hard to share all those things, particularly with people that had never come to see me or who had sporadically come to see me. So all those things was really difficult for me. And I know that many of the other exonerees, all the exonerees I know actually have suffered from those things.
You know, unfortunately, Jeffrey, Keon, we've run out of time for this segment of our show, but we'll certainly have each of you back to give an update. If you can, briefly share how people can get in contact with you, Jeffrey, in 3-4 seconds, I'd appreciate that. Similarly, you, Keon, and then we'll close out this segment on wrongful convictions.
My website, www.deskovic.org, DESKOVIC. There's an email form there. You can email me through that. I also have social media pages on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn.
Keon?
I have a Facebook page. It's under my name, Keon Sprinkle. And my Instagram name is 61 Chase City on Instagram.
Again, Jeffrey, Keon, thank you so much for joining us here at both sides of the bars. I really appreciate you sharing your observations and your thoughts and your personal experience about being wrongfully convicted as an exoneree. And I thank you, the viewers, for joining us all for this thought-provoking conversation. In the meantime, on behalf of the Fortune Society, we want to thank you so much for tuning in to Both Sides of the Bars. If you're interested in learning more about the Fortune Society, please go to our website, www.fortunesociety.org. That's www.fortunesociety.org. You can also find us on Facebook at the Fortune Society. My name is Andre Ward, and I thank you so much again for joining us here today on Both Sides of the Bars.